Hello, welcome. Welcome to my second reading stream. I am reading through the first book in Lemony Snicket's series of Unfortunate Events, which is my overall favorite book series of all time. I got a lot of good feedback on my first stream, and a lot of people saying, this is really relaxing to listen to while I do chores or laundry or whatever it is. So I figured I would keep going. Now, these streams work a little differently than my game streams, in the biggest difference being that I can't talk back to the chat as often as I can during the games. So once I start a chapter, I'm going to read through until the end of the chapter, and that's when I'll catch up on the chat and be able to chat back and forth with you guys. Also, a disclaimer for today's stream, I am just coming off of a really bad cold. I do still have a little bit of a cough. I just took some honey and a cough drop, and I have some Vicks Vapor Rub rubbed into my chest, which is probably why I look a little shiny over here on my neck. But anyway, just to kind of help me out a little bit. But if my voice starts to get a little weak, or if I have to stop and cough, I hope you'll forgive me. I just really wanted to get back into this. So I hope everybody's having a good night. Feel free to chat, even if I can't chat back with you for a little bit. Feel free to talk with each other. But really the point of this is really just so that you guys will enjoy the book. So I read the first 3 chapters, so we'll be starting on chapter 4. Chapter 4. The Baudelaire orphans copied the puttanesca recipe from the cookbook onto a piece of scrap paper, and Justice Strauss was kind enough to escort them to the market to buy the necessary ingredients. Count Olaf had not left them very much money, but the children were able to buy everything they needed. From a street vendor, they purchased olives after tasting several varieties and choosing their favorites. At the pasta store, they selected interestingly shaped noodles and asked the woman running the store the proper amount for 13 people, the 10 people Count Olaf mentioned, and the 3 of them. Then at the supermarket, they purchased garlic, which is a sharp-tasting bulbous plant, anchovies, which are small salty fish, capers, which are flower buds of a small shrub and taste marvelous, and tomatoes, which are actually fruits and not vegetables, as most people believe. They thought it would be proper to serve dessert, and they bought several envelopes of pudding mix. Perhaps, the orphans thought, if they made a delicious meal, Count Olaf might be a bit kinder to them. "Thank you so much for helping us out today," Violet said as she and her siblings walked home with Justice Strauss. "I don't know what we would have done without you." "You seem like very intelligent people," Justice Strauss said. "I dare say you would have thought of something, but it continues to strike me as odd that Count Olaf has asked you to prepare such an enormous meal. Well, here we are. I must go inside and put my own groceries away. I hope you children will come over soon and borrow books from my library." "Tomorrow?" Klaus said quickly. "Could we come over tomorrow?" "I don't see why not," Justice Strauss said, smiling. "I can't tell you how much we appreciate this," Violet said carefully. With their kind parents dead and Count Olaf treating them so abominably, the 3 children were not used to kindness from adults, and weren't sure if they were expected to do anything back. "Tomorrow, before we use your library again, Klaus and I would be more than happy to do household chores for you. Sunny isn't really old enough to work, but I'm sure we could find some way she could help you." Justice Strauss smiled at the 3 children, but her eyes were sad. She reached out a hand and put it on Violet's hair, and Violet felt more comforted than she had in some time. "That won't be necessary," Justice Strauss said. "You are always welcome in my home." Then she turned and went into her home, and after a moment of staring after her, the Baudelaire orphans went into theirs. For most of the afternoon, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny cooked the puttanesca sauce according to the recipe. Violet roasted the garlic and washed and chopped the anchovies. Klaus peeled the tomatoes and pitted the olives. Sunny banged on a pot with a wooden spoon, singing a rather repetitive song she had written all herself. And all 3 of the children had felt less miserable than they had since their arrival at Count Olaf's. The smell of cooking food is often a calming one, and the kitchen grew cozy as the sauce simmered, a culinary term which means cooked over low heat. The 3 orphans spoke of pleasant memories of their parents and about Justice Strauss, who they agreed was a wonderful neighbor, and in whose library they planned to spend a great deal of time. As they talked, they mixed and tasted the chocolate pudding. Just as they were placing the pudding in the refrigerator to cool, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny heard a loud booming sound as the front door was flung open, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you who was home. "Orphans!" Count Olaf called out in his scratchy voice. "Where are you, orphans?" "In the kitchen, Count Olaf," Klaus called. "We're just finishing dinner." "You'd better be," Count Olaf said, and strode into the kitchen. He gazed at all three Baudelaire orphans with his shiny, shiny eyes. "My troop is right behind me, and they are very hungry. Where's the roast beef?" "We didn't make roast beef," Violet said. "We made puttanesca sauce." "What?" Count Olaf asked. "No roast beef?" "You didn't tell us you wanted roast beef," Klaus said. Count Olaf slid toward the children so that he looked even taller than he was. His eyes grew even brighter, and his one eyebrow raised in anger. "In agreeing to adopt you," he said, "I have become your father, and as your father I am not someone to be trifled with. I demand that you serve roast beef to myself and my guests." "We don't have any!" Violet cried. "We made puttanesca sauce." "No, no, no!" Sunny shouted. Count Olaf looked down at Sunny, who had spoken so suddenly. With an inhuman roar he picked her up in one scraggly hand and raised her so she was staring at him in the eye. Needless to say, Sunny was very frightened and began crying immediately, too scared to even try to bite the hand that held her. "Put her down immediately, you beast!" Klaus shouted. He jumped up, trying to rescue Sunny from the grasp of the Count, but he was holding her too high to reach. Count Olaf looked down at Klaus and smiled a terrible, toothy grin, raising the wailing Sunny even up higher in the air. He seemed about to drop her to the floor when there was a huge burst of laughter in the next room. "Olaf! Where's Olaf?" voices called out. Count Olaf paused, still holding the wailing Sunny up in the air as members of his theater troupe walked into the kitchen. Soon they were crowding the room, an assortment of strange-looking characters of all shapes and sizes. There was a bald man with a very long nose, dressed in a long black robe. There were two women who had bright white powder all over their faces, making them look like ghosts. Behind the women was a man with a very long and skinny arms, and at the end of which were two hooks instead of hands. There was a person who was extremely fat and who looked like neither a man nor a woman. And behind this person, standing in the doorway, were an assortment of people the children could not see, but who promised to be just as frightening. "Here you are, Olaf," said one of the white-faced women. "What in the world are you doing?" "I'm just disciplining these orphans," Count Olaf said. "I asked them to make dinner, and all they've made is some disgusting sauce." "You can't go easy on children," the man with the hook hand said. "They must be taught to obey their elders." The tall, bald man peered at the youngsters. "Are these," he said to Count Olaf, "those wealthy children you were telling me about?" "Yes," Count Olaf said. "They are so awful that I can scarcely stand to touch them." With that he lowered Sunny, who was still wailing, to the floor. Violet and Klaus breathed a sigh of relief that he had not dropped her from that great height. "I don't blame you," said someone in the doorway. Count Olaf rubbed his hands together as if he'd been holding something revolting instead of an infant. "Well, enough talk," he said. "I suppose we will eat their dinner, even though it is all wrong. Everyone follow me to the dining room, and I will pour some wine. Perhaps by the time these brats serve us, we will be too drunk to care if it's roast beef or not." "Hurrah!" cried several members of the troupe, and they marched through the kitchen, following Count Olaf into the dining room. Nobody paid a bit of attention to the children, except for the bald man, who stopped and stared Violet in the eye. "You're a pretty one," he said, taking her face in his rough hands. "If I were you, I would try not to anger Count Olaf, or he might wreck that pretty little face of yours." Violet shuddered, and the bald man gave a high-pitched giggle and left the room. The Baudelaire children alone in the kitchen found themselves breathing heavily, as if they'd just run a long distance. Sunny continued to wail, and Klaus found that his eyes were wet with tears as well. Only Violet didn't cry, but merely trembled with fear and revulsion, a word which here means an unpleasant mixture of horror and disgust. For several moments none of them could speak. "This is terrible. Terrible," Klaus finally said. "Violet, what can we do?" "I don't know," she said. "I'm afraid." "Me too," Klaus said. "Hooks," Sunny said as she stopped crying. "Let's have some dinner!" someone shouted from the dining room, and the theater troupe began pounding on the table in strict rhythm, which is an exceedingly rude thing to do. "We'd better serve the puttanesca," Klaus said, "or who knows what Count Olaf will do to us." Violet thought of what the bald man had said about wrecking her face and nodded. The two of them looked at the pot of bubbling sauce, which had seemed so cozy while they were making it, and now it looked like a vat of blood. Then, leaving Sunny behind in the kitchen, they walked into the dining room, Klaus carrying a bowl of the interestingly shaped noodles, and Violet carrying the pot of puttanesca sauce and a large ladle with which to serve it. The theater troupe was talking and cackling, drinking again and again from their wine cups, and paying no attention to the Baudelaire orphans as they circled the table, serving everyone dinner. Violet's right hand ached from holding the heavy ladle. She thought of switching to her left hand, but because she was right-handed, she was afraid she might spill the sauce with her left hand, which would enrage Count Olaf again. She stared miserably at Olaf's plate of food and found herself wishing she had bought poison at the market and putting that in the puttanesca sauce. Finally, they were through serving, and Klaus and Violet slipped back into the kitchen. They listened to the wild, rough laughter of Count Olaf and his theater troupe, and they picked at their own portions of food, too miserable to eat. Before long, Olaf's friends were pounding on the table in strict rhythm again, and the orphans went out into the dining room to clear the table, and then again to serve the chocolate pudding. By now it was obvious that Count Olaf and his associates had drunk a great deal of wine, and they slouched at the table and spoke much less. Finally they roused themselves and trooped back through the kitchen, scarcely glancing at the children on their way out of the house. Count Olaf looked around the room, which was filled with dirty dishes. "Because you haven't cleaned up yet," he said to the orphans, "I suppose you can be excused from attending tonight's performance, but after cleaning up you are to go straight to your beds." Klaus had been glaring at the floor, trying to hide how upset he was, but at this he could not remain silent. "You mean our bed?" he shouted. "You've only provided us with one bed." Members of the theater troupe stopped in their tracks at this outburst, and glanced from Klaus to Count Olaf to see what would happen next. Count Olaf raised his one eyebrow, and his eyes shone bright, but he spoke calmly. "If you would like another bed," he said, "tomorrow you may go into town and purchase one." "You know perfectly well we haven't any money," Klaus said. "Of course you do," Count Olaf said, and his voice began to get a little louder. "You are the inheritors of an enormous fortune." "That money," Klaus said, remembering what Mr. Poe said, "is not to be used until Violet is of age." Count Olaf's face grew very red. For a moment he said nothing. Then in one sudden movement he reached down and struck Klaus across the face. Klaus fell to the floor, his face inches from the eye tattooed on Olaf's ankle. His glasses leapt from his face and skittered into a corner. His left cheek, where Olaf had struck him, felt as if it were on fire. The theater troupe laughed, and a few of them applauded, as if Count Olaf had done something very brave instead of something despicable. "Come on, friends," Count Olaf said to his comrades. "We'll be late for our performance." "If I know you, Olaf," said the man with the hook hands, "you'll figure out a way to get at that Baudelaire money." "We'll see," Count Olaf said, but his eyes were shining bright as if he already had an idea. There was another loud boom as the front door shut behind Count Olaf and his terrible friends, and the Baudelaire children were alone in the kitchen. Violet knelt at Klaus's side, giving him a hug to try to make him feel better. Sunny crawled over to his glasses, picked them up, and brought them to him. Klaus began to sob, not so much from the pain, but from the rage at the terrible situation they were in. Violet and Sunny cried with him, and they continued weeping as they washed the dishes, and as they blew out the candles in the dining room, and as they changed out of their clothes and lay down to go to sleep, Klaus in the bed, Violet on the floor, Sunny on her little cushion of curtains. The moonlight shone through the window, and if anyone had looked into the Baudelaire orphan's bedroom, they would have seen 3 children crying quietly all night long. End of chapter. Oh, hi, guys. I'm so glad you could make it. Welcome, Moocher DK. I haven't seen you around before, but glad to have you. Hope you're having a good night. I hope you're enjoying the stream. I must rehydrate. And on we press. I always feel so bad, like, reading Count Olaf's part, because I want to do a good job, obviously, but then I'm like, I feel like a jerk, even though these are not my words. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Chapter 5. Unless you have been very, very lucky, you have undoubtedly experienced events in your life that have made you cry. So unless you have been very, very lucky, you know that a good long session of weeping can often make you feel better, even if your circumstances have not changed one bit. So it was with the Baudelaire orphans. Having cried all night, they rose the next morning feeling as if a weight were off their shoulders. The three children knew, of course, that they were still in a terrible situation, but they thought they might do something to make it better. The morning's note from Count Olaf ordered them to chop firewood in the backyard, and as Violet and Klaus swung the axe down over each log to break it into smaller pieces, they discussed possible plans of action, while Sunny chewed meditatively on a small piece of wood. Clearly, Klaus said, fingering the ugly bruise on his face where Olaf had struck him, we cannot stay here any longer. I would rather take my chances on the streets than live in this terrible place. But who knows what misfortunes would befall us on the streets, Violet pointed out. At least here we have a roof over our heads. I wish our parents' money could be used now instead of when you come of age, Klaus said. Then we could buy a castle and live in it, with armed guards patrolling the outside to keep out Count Olaf and his troop. And I could have a large inventing studio, Violet said wistfully. She swung the axe down and split a log neatly in two, filled with gears and pulleys and wires and an elaborate computer system. And I could have a large library, Klaus said, as comfortable as Justice Strauss's but more enormous. Gibbo, Sunny shrieked, which appeared to mean, and I could have a lot of things to bite. But in the meantime, Violet said, we have to do something about our predicament. Perhaps Justice Strauss could adopt us, Klaus said. She said we were always welcome in her home. But she meant for a visit, or to use her library, Violet pointed out. She didn't mean to live. Perhaps if we explained our situation to her, she would agree to adopt us, Klaus said hopefully, but when Violet looked at him, she saw that he knew it was of no use. Adoption is an enormous decision, and not likely to happen impulsively. I'm sure you in your life have occasionally wished to be raised by different people than the ones who were raising you, but knew in your heart that the chances of this were slim. I think we should go see Mr. Poe, Violet said. He told us when he dropped us here that we could contact him at the bank if we had any questions. We don't really have a question, Klaus said. We have a complaint. He was thinking of Mr. Poe walking toward them at Briny Beach with his terrible message. Even though the fire was of course not Mr. Poe's fault, Klaus was reluctant to see Mr. Poe because he was afraid of getting more bad news. I can't think of anyone else to contact, Violet said. Mr. Poe is in charge of our affairs, and I'm sure if he knew how horrid Count Olaf was, he'd get us right out of here. Klaus pictured Mr. Poe arriving in his car and putting the Baudelaire orphans inside to go somewhere else and felt a stirring of hope. Anywhere would be better than here. Okay, he said, let's get this firewood all chopped and we'll go to the bank. Invigorated by their plan, the Baudelaire orphans swung their axes at an amazing speed, and soon enough they were done chopping firewood and ready to go to the bank. They remembered Count Olaf saying he had a map of the city, and they looked thoroughly for it, but they couldn't find any trace of a map, and decided it must be in the tower where they were forbidden to go. So without directions of any sort, the Baudelaire children set off for the city's banking district in hopes of finding Mr. Poe. After walking through the meat district, the flower district, and the sculpture district, the three children arrived at the banking district, pausing to take a refreshing sip of water at the fountain of victorious finance. The banking district consisted of several wide streets with large marble buildings on each side of them, all banks. They first went to Trustworthy Bank, then to Faithful Savings and Loan, and then to Subservient Financial Services, each time inquiring for Mr. Poe. Finally, a receptionist at Subservient said she knew that Mr. Poe worked down the street, at the Mortuary Money Management. The building was square and rather plain-looking, though once inside, the three orphans were intimidated by the hustle and bustle of the people as they raced around the large, echoey room. Finally, they asked a uniformed guard whether they had arrived at the right place to speak to Mr. Poe, and he led them into a large office with many file cabinets and no windows. "Why, hello," said Mr. Poe in a puzzled tone of voice. He was sitting at a desk covered in typed papers that looked important and boring. Surrounding a small framed photograph of his wife and his two beastly sons were three telephones with flashing lights. "Please, come in." "Thank you," said Klaus, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. The Baudelaire youngsters sat down in the three large and comfortable chairs. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to speak, but had to cough into a handkerchief before he could begin. "I'm very busy today," he said finally, "so I don't have too much time to chat. Next time you should call ahead of time when you plan on being in the neighborhood, and I will put some time aside to take you to lunch." "That'd be very pleasant," Violet said, "and we're sorry we didn't contact you before we stopped by, but we find ourselves in an urgent situation. Count Olaf is a madman. Klaus said, getting right to the point. "We cannot stay with him." "He struck Klaus across the face. See his bruise?" Violet said, but just as she said it, one of the telephones rang in a loud, unpleasant wail. "Excuse me," Mr. Poe said, and picked up the phone. "Poe here," he said into the receiver. "What?" "Yes. Yes. 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 No. Yes. Thank you." He hung up the phone and looked at the Baudelaires as if he'd forgotten they were there. "I'm sorry," Mr. Poe said. "What were we talking about? Oh, yes, Count Olaf. I'm sorry you don't have a good first impression of him." "He only provided us one bed," Klaus said. "He makes us do a great many difficult chores. He drinks so much wine." "Excuse me," Mr. Poe said as another telephone rang. "Poe here," he said. "7. 7. 7. 7. 6.5. 7. You're welcome." He hung up and quickly wrote something down on one of his papers, then looked up at the children. "I'm sorry," he said. "What were you saying about Count Olaf? Making you do chores does not sound that bad. He calls us orphans. He has terrible friends. He's always asking us about our money. Poco!" This was from Sonny. Mr. Poe put up his hands to indicate he'd heard enough. "Children, children," he said. "You must give yourselves time to adjust to your new home. You've only been there a few days." "We have been there long enough to know Count Olaf is a bad man," Klaus said. Mr. Poe sighed and looked at each of the 3 children. His face was kind, but it didn't look like he really believed what the Baudelaire children were saying. "Are you familiar with the Latin term, in loco parentis?" he said. Violet and Sonny looked at Klaus. The biggest reader of the 3, he was the most likely to know vocabulary words and foreign phrases. "Something about trains?" he asked. Maybe Mr. Poe was going to take them by train to another relative. Mr. Poe shook his head. "In loco parentis means acting in the role of a parent," he said. "It's a legal term, and it applies to Count Olaf. Now that you are in his care, the Count may raise you using any method he sees fit. I'm sorry if your parents did not make you do any chores, or if you never saw them drink any wine, or if you like their friends better than Count Olaf's friends, but these are things that you must get used to, as Count Olaf is acting in loco parentis. Understand?" "But he struck my brother," Violet said. "Look at his face." As Violet spoke, Mr. Poe reached into his pocket for his handkerchief and, covering his mouth, coughed many, many times into it. He coughed so loudly that Violet could not be certain he'd heard her. "Whatever Count Olaf has done," Mr. Poe said, glancing down at one of his papers and circling a number, "he has acted in loco parentis, and there is nothing I can do about it. Your money will be well protected by myself and by the bank, but Count Olaf's parenting techniques are his own business. Now, I hate to usher you out post haste, but I have very much work to do." The children just sat there, stunned. Mr. Poe looked up and cleared his throat. "Post haste," he said, means you'll do nothing to help us," Violet finished for him. She was shaking with anger and frustration. As one of the phones began ringing, she stood up and walked out of the room, followed by Klaus, who was carrying Sonny. They stalked out of the bank and stood on the street, not knowing what to do next. "What shall we do next?" Klaus asked sadly. Violet stared up at the sky. She wished she could invent something that could take them out of there. "It's getting a bit late," she said. "We might as well go back and think of something else tomorrow. Perhaps we can stop and see Justice Strauss." "But you said she wouldn't help us," Klaus said. "Not for help," Violet said, "but for books. It is very useful when one is young to learn the difference between literally and figuratively. If something happens literally, it actually happens. If something happens figuratively, it feels like it's happening. If you are literally jumping for joy, for instance, it means you are leaping in the air because you're very happy. If you're figuratively jumping for joy, it means you're so happy that you could jump for joy but are saving your energy for other matters." The Baudelaire orphans walked back to Count Olaf's neighborhood and stopped at the home of Justice Strauss, who welcomed them inside and let them choose books from her library. Violet chose several about mechanical inventions, Klaus chose several about wolves, and Sonny found a book with many pictures of teeth inside. They then went to their room and crowded together on the one bed, reading intently and happily. Figuratively, they escaped from Count Olaf and their miserable existence. They did not literally escape, because they were still in his house and vulnerable to Count Olaf's evil in loco parentis ways. But by immersing themselves in their favorite reading topics, they felt far away from their predicament, as if they had escaped. In the situation of the orphans, figuratively escaping was not enough, of course, but at the end of a tiring and hopeless day, it would have to do. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny read their books, and in the back of their minds hoped that soon their figurative escape would eventually turn into a literal one. All right, end of chapter. Let's check it out. The voice-activated menu. Yeah, you're right. I'm glad you guys are enjoying it. I finished 5 chapters. I think there are 13. Let me see. Yeah, there's 13 chapters, so I'm going to try to finish 6 and 7 tonight. Oh, hang on. Let me quickly check something. Okay. Rehydrate. Oh, I've read this series. Come on. All right. Chapter 6. The next morning, when the children stumbled sleepily from their bedroom into the kitchen, rather than a note from Count Olaf, they found Count Olaf himself. "Good morning, orphans," he said. "I have your oatmeal all ready in bowls for you." The children took seats at the kitchen table and stared nervously into their oatmeal. If you knew Count Olaf, and he suddenly served you a meal, wouldn't you be afraid there was something terrible in it, like poison or ground glass? But instead, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny found that fresh raspberries had been sprinkled on top of each of their portions. The Baudelaire orphans hadn't had raspberries since their parents died, although they were extremely fond of them. "Thank you," Klaus said, carefully picking up one of the raspberries and examining it. Perhaps these were poison berries that just looked like delicious ones. Count Olaf, seeing how suspiciously Klaus was looking at the berries, smiled and plucked a berry out of Sunny's bowl. Looking at each of the 3 youngsters, he popped it into his mouth and ate it. "Aren't raspberries delicious?" he asked. "They were my favorite berries when I was your age." Violet tried to picture Count Olaf as a youngster, but couldn't. His shiny eyes and bony hands and shadowy smile all seemed to be things only adults possess. Despite her fear of him, however, she took her spoon in her right hand and began to eat her oatmeal. Count Olaf had eaten some, so it probably wasn't poisonous, and anyway, she was very hungry. Klaus began to eat too, as did Sunny, who got oatmeal and raspberries all over her face. "I received a phone call yesterday," Count Olaf said, "from Mr. Poe. He told me you children had been to see him." The children exchanged glances. They had hoped their visit would be taken in confidence, a phrase which here means kept a secret between Mr. Poe and themselves and not blabbed to Count Olaf. "Mr. Poe told me," Count Olaf said, "that you appeared to be having some difficulty adjusting to the life I have so graciously provided for you. I'm very sorry to hear that." The children looked at Count Olaf. His face was very serious, as if he were very sorry to hear that, but his eyes were so shiny and bright, the way they are when someone's telling a joke. "Is that so?" Violet said. "I'm sorry that Mr. Poe bothered you." "I'm glad he did," Count Olaf said, "because I want the 3 of you to feel at home here now that I am your father." The children shuddered a little at that, remembering their own kind father and gazing sadly at the poor substitute now sitting across the table from them. "Lately," Count Olaf said, "I have been very nervous about my performances with the theater troupe, and I am afraid I may have acted a bit standoffish." The word standoffish is a wonderful one, but it does not describe Count Olaf's behavior toward the children. It means reluctant to associate with others, and it might describe somebody who during a party would stand in a corner and not talk to anyone. It would not describe somebody who provides one bed for 3 people to sleep in, forces them to do horrible chores, and strikes them across the face. There are many words for people like that, but standoffish is not one of them. Klaus knew the word standoffish and almost laughed out loud at Olaf's incorrect use of it, but his face still had a bruise on it, so Klaus remained silent. "Therefore, to make you feel a little more at home here, I would like to have you participate in my next play. Perhaps if you took part in the work I do, you would be less likely to run off complaining to Mr. Poe." "In what way would we participate?" Violet asked. She was thinking of all the chores they already did for Count Olaf and was not in the mood to do more. "Well," Count Olaf said, his eyes shining brightly, "the play is called The Marvelous Marriage, and it is written by the great playwright Al Funcoot. We will give only one performance on this Friday night. It's about a man who is very brave and intelligent, played by me. In the finale, he marries the young, beautiful woman he loves in front of a crowd of cheering people. You, Klaus, and you, Sonny, will play some of the cheering people in the crowd." "But we're shorter than most adults," Klaus said. "Won't that look strange to the audience?" "You will be playing two midgets who attend the wedding," Olaf said patiently. "Well, what will I do?" Violet asked. "I'm handy with tools, so perhaps I could help you build the set." "Build the set? Heavens, no!" Count Olaf said. "A pretty girl like you shouldn't be working backstage." "But I'd like to," Violet said. Count Olaf's one eyebrow raised slightly, and the Baudelaire orphans recognized the sign of his anger. But then the eyebrow went down again as he forced himself to remain calm. "But I have such an important role for you on stage," he said. "You are going to play the young woman I marry." Violet felt her oatmeal and raspberries shift around in her stomach as if she'd just caught the flu. It was bad enough having Count Olaf acting in loco parentis and announcing himself as their father, but to consider this man her husband, even for the purposes of a play, was even more dreadful. "It is a very important role," he continued, his mouth curling up into an unconvincing smile. "Although you have no other lines than I do, which you will say when Justice Strauss asks you if you will have me." "Justice Strauss?" Violet said. "What does she have to do with it?" "She has agreed to play the part of the judge," Count Olaf said. Behind him, one of the eyes painted on the kitchen walls closely watched over each of the Baudelaire children. "I asked Justice Strauss to participate because I wanted to be neighborly, as well as fatherly." "Count Olaf," Violet said, and then stopped herself. She wanted to argue her way out of playing his bride, but she didn't want to make him angry. "Father," she said, "I'm not sure I'm talented enough to perform professionally. I would hate to disgrace your good name and the name of Al Funcoot. Plus, I'll be very busy in the next few weeks working on my inventions and learning how to prepare roast beef," she added quickly, remembering how he had behaved about dinner. Count Olaf reached out one of his spidery hands and stroked Violet on the chin, looking deep into her eyes. "You will," he said, "participate in this theatrical performance. I would prefer it if you would participate voluntarily, but as I believe Mr. Poe explained to you, I can order you to participate, and you must obey." Olaf's sharp and dirty fingernails gently scratched on Violet's chin, and she shivered. The room was very, very quiet as Olaf finally let go and stood up and left without a word. The Baudelaire children listened to his heavy footsteps go up the stairs to the tower they were forbidden to enter. "Well," Klaus said hesitantly, "I guess it won't hurt to be in the play. It seems to be very important to him, and we want to keep on his good side." "But he must be up to something," Violet said. "You don't think those berries were poisoned, do you?" Klaus asked worriedly. "No," Violet said. "Olaf is after the fortune we will inherit. Killing us would do him no good." But what good does it do him to have us be in his stupid play?" "I don't know," Violet admitted miserably. She stood up and started washing out the oatmeal bowls. "I wish we knew something more about inheritance law," Klaus said. "I'll bet Count Olaf has cooked up some plan to get our money, but I don't know what it could be." "I guess we could ask Mr. Poe about it," Violet said doubtfully, as Klaus stood beside her and dried the dishes. "He knows all those Latin legal phrases." "But Mr. Poe would probably call Count Olaf again, and then he'd just know we were on to him," Klaus pointed out. "Maybe we should try to talk to Justice Strauss. She's a judge, so she must know all about the law." "But she's also Olaf's neighbor," Violet replied, "and she might tell him that we had asked." Klaus took his glasses off, which he often did when he was thinking hard. "How could we find out about the law without Olaf's knowledge?" "Book!" Sonny shouted suddenly. She probably meant something like, "Would someone please wipe my face?" but it made Violet and Klaus look at each other. Book. They were both thinking the same thing. Surely Justice Strauss would have a book on inheritance law. "Count Olaf didn't leave us any chores to do," Violet said. So I suppose we're free to visit Justice Strauss in her library. Klaus smiled. Yes, indeed, he said. You know, today I don't think I'm going to choose a book on wolves. Nor I, Violet said, on mechanical engineering. I think I'd like to read about inheritance law. Well, let's go, Klaus said. Justice Strauss said we could come over soon and we don't want to be standoffish. At the mention of the word that Count Olaf had used so ridiculously, the Baudelaire orphans all laughed, even Sonny, who of course did not have a very big vocabulary. Swiftly they put away the clean oatmeal bowls in the kitchen cupboards, which watched them with painted eyes. Then the three young people ran next door. Friday, the day of their performance, was only a few days off, and the children wanted to figure out Count Olaf's plan as quickly as possible. All right, let's check this. How many times have I read this whole series? I think start to finish 4 times through completely. And then I've read some of my favorites more than that. She doesn't read it to end, and how I'll never get any sleep. Yeah, I'm not going to read all of it today. I wish I could, but I'm not going to. I don't want to be up too late. All right. Moving on. Chapter 7. There are many, many types of books in the world, which makes good sense because there are many, many types of people, and everybody wants to read something different. For instance, people who hate stories in which terrible things happen to small children should put this book down immediately. But one type of book that practically no one likes to read is a book about the law. Books about the law are notorious for being very long, very dull, and very difficult to read. This is one reason many lawyers make heaps of money. The money is an incentive. The word incentive here means an offered reward to persuade you to do something you don't want to do. To read long, dull, and difficult books. The Baudelaire children had slightly different incentive for reading these books, of course. Their incentive was not heaps of money, but preventing Count Olaf from doing something horrible to them in order to get heaps of money. But even with this incentive, getting through the law books in Justice Strauss's private library was a very, very, very hard task. Goodness, Justice Strauss said when she came into the library and saw what they were reading. She had let them into the house, but immediately went into the backyard to do her gardening, leaving the Baudelaire orphans alone in her glorious library. I thought you were interested in mechanical engineering, animals of North America, and teeth. Are you sure you want to read those enormous law books? Even I don't like reading them, and I work in law. Yes, Violet lied. I find them very interesting, Justice Strauss. So do I, Klaus also lied. Violet and I are considering a career in law, so we're fascinated by these books. Well, Justice Strauss said, Sonny can't possibly be interested. Maybe she'd like to come help me with the gardening? Weepy! Sonny shrieked, which meant I'd much prefer gardening to sitting around watching my siblings struggle through law books. Well, make sure she doesn't eat any dirt, Klaus said, bringing Sonny over to the judge. Of course, said Justice Strauss. We wouldn't want her to be sick for the big performance. Violet and Klaus exchanged a look. Are you excited about the play? Violet asked hesitantly. Justice Strauss's face lit up. Oh, yes, she said. I've always wanted to perform on stage ever since I was a little girl. And now Count Olaf has given me the opportunity to live my lifelong dream. Aren't you thrilled to be a part of the theater? I guess so, Violet said. Of course you are, Justice Strauss said, stars in her eyes and Sonny in her hands. She left the library and Klaus and Violet looked at each other and sighed. She's stage-struck, Klaus said. She won't believe that Count Olaf is up to something, no matter what. She wouldn't help us anyway, Violet pointed out glumly. She's a judge, and she'd just start babbling about in loco parentis like Mr. Poe did. That's why we've got to find a legal reason to stop this performance, Klaus said firmly. Have you found anything in your book yet? Nothing helpful, Violet said, glancing down at a piece of scrap paper on which she had been taking notes. 50 years ago, there was a woman who left an enormous sum of money to her pet weasel and none to her 3 sons. The 3 sons tried to prove that the woman was insane so the money could go to them. What happened? Klaus asked. I think the weasel died, Violet replied, but I'm not sure. I have to look up some of these words. I don't think that's going to help us anyway, Klaus said. Maybe Count Olaf is trying to prove that we're insane so he'd get the money, Violet said. But why would making us be in the marvelous marriage prove that we were insane? Klaus asked. I don't know, Violet admitted. I'm stuck. Have you found anything? Around the time of your weasel, lady, Klaus said, flipping through the enormous book he'd been reading, a group of actors put on a production of Shakespeare's Macbeth, and none of them wore any clothes. Violet blushed. You mean they were all naked on stage? Only briefly, Klaus said, smiling. The police came and shut down the production. I don't think that's very helpful either. It was just pretty interesting to read about. Violet sighed. Maybe Count Olaf isn't up to anything, she said. I'm not interested in performing in his play, but perhaps we're all worked up about nothing. Maybe Count Olaf really is just trying to welcome us into the family. How can you say that? Klaus cried. He struck me across the face. But there's no way he can get a hold of our fortune just by putting us in a play, Violet said. My eyes are tired from reading these books, Klaus, and they just aren't helping us. I'm going to go out and help Justice Strauss in the garden. Klaus watched his sister leave the library and felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. The day of the performance was not far off, and he hadn't even figured out what Count Olaf was up to, let alone how to stop him. All his life, Klaus had believed that if you read enough books you could solve any problem, but now he wasn't so sure. You there! A voice coming from the doorway startled Klaus out of his thoughts. Count Olaf sent me to look for you. You are to return to the house immediately. Klaus turned and saw one of the members of Count Olaf's theater troupe, the one with hooks for hands, standing in the doorway. What are you doing in this musty old room anyway? He asked in his croak of a voice, walking over to where Klaus was sitting. Narrowing his beady eyes, he saw the title of one of the books. Inheritance Law and Its Implications, he asked sharply. Why are you reading that? Why do you think I'm reading it? Klaus said. I'll tell you what I think. The man put one of his terrible hooks on Klaus's shoulders. I think you should never be allowed inside this library again, at least until Friday. We don't want a little boy getting big ideas. Now where's your sister and that hideous baby? In the garden, Klaus said, shrugging the hook off his shoulder. Why don't you go and get them? The man leaned over until his face was just inches from Klaus's, so close that the man's features flickered into a blur. Listen to me very carefully, little boy, he said, breathing out foul steam with every word. The only reason Count Olaf hasn't torn you limb from limb is that he hasn't gotten hold of your money. He allows you to live while he works out his plans, but ask yourself this, you little bookworm. What reason will he have to keep you alive after he has your money? What do you think will happen to you then? Klaus felt an icy chill go through him as the horrible man spoke. He'd never been so terrified all his life. He found that his arms and legs were shaking uncontrollably as if he were having some sort of fit. His mouth was making strange sounds like Sonny always did, as he struggled to find something to say. Klaus heard himself choke out. When the time comes, the hook-handed man said smoothly, ignoring Klaus's noises, I believe Count Olaf might just leave you to me. So if I were you, I'd start acting a little nicer. The man stood up again and put both his hooks in front of Klaus's face, letting the light from the reading lamps reflect off the wicked-looking devices. Now, if you will excuse me, I have to fetch your poor orphan siblings. Klaus felt his body go limp as the hook-handed man left the room, and he wanted to sit there for a moment and catch his breath, but his mind wouldn't let him. This was his last moment in this library, and perhaps his last opportunity to foil Count Olaf's plan, but what to do? Hearing the faint sounds of the hook-handed man talking to Justice Strauss in the garden, Klaus started looking frantically around the library for something that could be helpful. Then, just as he heard the man's footsteps heading back his way, Klaus spied one book and quickly grabbed it. He untucked his shirt and put the book inside, hastily retucking it just as the hook-handed man re-entered the library, escorting Violet and carrying Sonny, who was trying without success to bite the man's hooks. I'm ready to go, Klaus said quickly, and walked out the door before the man could get a good look at him. He walked quickly ahead of his siblings, hoping that nobody would notice the book lumped in his shirt. Maybe, just maybe, the book Klaus was smuggling could save their lives. It's 3 a.m. here. Oh boy, where are you from? Hi, Emmy, welcome. And hello. John, right? I haven't seen you in a while. Hope you've been well. Thanks for joining. All right, some more. Went to Chick-fil-A. Had me some Chick-fil-A for dinner. I hope you guys are having a good time. It's 9:20. I think I've been going for about 45 minutes so far. Oh, you're from Denmark. You probably should get to sleep. I'm so sorry for keeping you up. I've been reading. I think I've been going for about 45 minutes. We finished 7 chapters out of 13 for the book. Do you guys want me to keep going for a little bit? Sorry, Summer. I'll let you guys kind of make the decision if you want me to keep going. I'll keep going for a little bit, probably another 20 to 30 minutes, and then we can finish up the book on my next stream. Waiting for some input. Split it in the middle now? Okay. All right. Then this will be it for the night. Yes, John, I will be streaming Nancy Drew soon. I'm currently on Trail of the Twister as far as the games go. So as soon as I can get with my best friend and we have the same day off and she can come over, then we'll be streaming Trail of the Twister. I think I might do one more chapter and then call it a night. That way I'll still have a good chunk of the book to do for my next stream. All right. One more chapter for the night. Obviously, we have to figure out what Klaus put under his shirt. Okay. Chapter 8. Klaus stayed up all night reading, which was normally something he loved to do. Back when his parents were alive, Klaus used to take a flashlight to bed with him and hide under the covers, reading until he couldn't keep his eyes open. Some mornings, his father would come into Klaus's room to wake him up and find him asleep, still clutching his flashlight in one hand and his book in the other. But on this particular night, of course, the circumstances were much different. Klaus stood by the window, squinting as he read his smuggled book by the moonlight that trickled into the room. He occasionally glanced at his sisters. Violet was sleeping fitfully, a word which here means with much tossing and turning, on the lumpy bed, and Sunny had wormed her way onto the pile of curtains so that she looked just like a small heap of cloth. Klaus had not told his siblings about the book because he didn't want to give them false hope. He wasn't sure the book would help them out of their dilemma. The book was long and difficult to read, and Klaus became more and more tired as the night wore on. Occasionally his eyes would close. He found himself reading the same sentence over and over. He found himself reading the same sentence over and over. He found himself reading the same sentence over and over. But then he would remember the way the hook hands of Count Olaf's associate had glinted in the library, and would imagine them tearing into his flesh, and he would wake right up and continue reading. He found a small scrap of paper and tore it into strips, which he used to mark significant parts of the book. By the time the light outside grew gray with the approaching dawn, Klaus had found out all he needed to know. His hopes rose along with the sun. Finally, when the first few birds began to sing, Klaus tiptoed to the door of the bedroom and eased it open quietly, careful not to wake the restless Violet or Sunny, who was still hidden in the pile of curtains. Then he went to the kitchen and sat and waited for Count Olaf. He didn't have to wait long before he heard Olaf tromping down the tower stairs. When Count Olaf walked into the kitchen, he saw Klaus sitting at the table and smirked, a word which here means smiled in an unfriendly, phony way. "Hello, orphan," he said. "You're up early." Klaus's heart was beating fast, but he felt calm on the outside, as if he had on a layer of invisible armor. "I've been up all night," he said, "reading this book." He put the book out on the table so Olaf could see it. "It's called Nuptial Law," Klaus said, "and I learned many interesting things while I read it." Count Olaf had taken out a bottle of wine to pour himself some breakfast, but when he saw the book he stopped and sat down. "The word nuptial," Klaus said, "means relating to marriage." "I know what the word means," Count Olaf growled. "Where did you get that book?" "From Justice Strauss's library," Klaus said, "but that's not really important. What's important is I've found out your plan." "Is that so?" Count Olaf said, his one eyebrow raising. "What is my plan, you little runt?" Klaus ignored the insult and opened the book to where one of the scraps of paper was marking his place. "The laws of marriage in this community are very simple," he read out loud. "The requirements are as follows: the presence of a judge, a statement of I do by both the bride and the groom, and the signing of an explanatory document in the bride's own hand." Klaus put down the book and pointed at Count Olaf. "If my sister says I do and signs a piece of paper while Justice Strauss is in the room, then she's legally married. This play you're putting on shouldn't be called The Marvelous Marriage. It should be called The Menacing Marriage. You're not going to marry Violet figuratively. You're going to marry her literally. This play won't be pretend. It'll be real and legally binding." Count Olaf laughed. A hoarse, rough laugh. "Your sister isn't old enough to get married." "She can get married if she has the permission of her legal guardian acting in loco parentis," Klaus said. "I read that too. You can't fool me." "Why in the world would I want to actually marry your sister?" Count Olaf said. "It is true she's very pretty, but a man like myself can acquire any number of beautiful women." Klaus turned to a different section of nuptial law. "A legal husband," he read out loud, "has the right to control any money in the possession of his legal wife." Klaus gazed at Count Olaf in triumph. "You're going to marry my sister to gain control of the Baudelaire fortune. Or at least that's what you plan to do. But when I show this information to Mr. Poe, your play will not be performed and you will go to jail." Count Olaf's eyes grew very shiny, but he continued to smirk at Klaus. This was surprising. "Wah!" Klaus had guessed that once he announced what he knew, this dreadful man would have been very angry, even violent. After all, he'd had a furious outburst just because he wanted roast beef instead of puttanesca sauce. Surely he'd be even more enraged to have his plan discovered. But Count Olaf just sat there as calmly as if they were discussing the weather. "I guess you found me out," Olaf said simply. "Suppose you're right. I'll go to prison. You and the other orphans will go free. Now why don't you just run up to your room and wake your sisters? I'm sure they'll want to know all about your grand victory over my evil ways." Klaus looked closely at Count Olaf, who was continuing to smile as if he just told a clever joke. Why wasn't he threatening Klaus in anger, or tearing his hair out in frustration, or running to pack his clothes and escape? This wasn't happening at all the way that Klaus pictured it. "Well, I will go tell my sisters," he said, and walked back into his bedroom. Violet was still dozing on the bed, and Sunny was still hidden beneath the curtains. Klaus woke Violet up first. "I stayed up all night reading," Klaus said breathlessly as his sister opened her eyes, "and I discovered what Count Olaf is up to. He plans to marry you for real, when you and Justice Strauss and everyone all think it's just a play, and once he's your husband, he'll have control of our parents' money and he can dispose of us." "How can he marry me for real?" Violet asked. "It's only a play." "The only legal requirements of marriage in this community," Klaus explained, holding up nuptial law to show his sister where he'd learned the information, "are your saying I do, and signing a document in your own hand in the presence of a judge like Justice Strauss." "But surely I'm not old enough to get married," Violet said. "I'm only 14. "Girls under the age of 18, Klaus said, flipping to another part of the book, "can marry if they have the permission of their legal guardian, and that's Count Olaf." "No!" Violet cried. "What can we do?" "We can show this to Mr. Poe," Klaus said, pointing to the book, "and he will finally believe us that Count Olaf is up to no good. Quick, get dressed while I wake up Sunny, and we can be at the bank by the time it opens." Violet, who usually moved slowly in the mornings, nodded and immediately got out of bed and went to the cardboard box to find some proper clothing. Klaus walked over to the lump of curtains to wake up his younger sister. "Sunny," he called out kindly, putting his hand on where he thought his sister's head was. "Sunny?" There was no answer. Klaus called out Sonny again and pulled away the top fold of the curtains to wake up the youngest Baudelaire child. "Sonny?" he said, but then he stopped, for underneath the curtain was nothing but another curtain. He moved aside all the layers, but his little sister was nowhere to be found. "Sonny!" he yelled, looking around the room. Violet dropped the dress she was holding and began to help him search. They looked in every corner, under the bed, and even inside the cardboard box, but Sonny was gone. "Where could she be?" Violet asked worriedly. "She's not the type to run off." "Where could she be, indeed?" said a voice behind them, and the two children turned around. Count Olaf was standing in the doorway, watching Violet and Klaus as they searched the room. His eyes were shining brighter than they ever had, and he was still smiling like he'd just uttered a joke. All right, guys. Thank you guys for coming and joining. So we have completed 8 chapters in The Bad Beginning, Book 1 of a series of unfortunate events by Lemony Snicket. I really hope to be able to finish this book up in the next week or so, in time for the premiere of the new Netflix series, which comes out January 13th. Not a sponsor, just a fan, wanting to let you guys know if you enjoy the book series, enjoy this story. They're making that new Netflix series with Neil Patrick Harris playing Olaf. It's going to be really cool. Premieres on Netflix on January 13th, which is Friday the 13th. Have a wonderful rest of the night. I will be back soon to either finish the book or to play Nancy Drew Trail of the Twister. If you're not following me on Twitch, please feel free. I would love to follow. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the night. Take care of yourselves for the rest of the week. If you're here in the States, have a wonderful Thanksgiving. If you're not in the States, still have a wonderful week. And I will see you all again soon. Have a wonderful night.